Or did I?
Yeah, you did.
Well, no, I really
You
did.
see? Not a hole on me.
I wasn't trying to...
You should really work on your aim.
You know what? I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to let this next part be a surprise.
I think I need to clear something up before we get started here. My intent with these deranged videos about the Twisted Arbalest is strictly to explore forcing this to be a full-time strategy. That means all content in the game. If you make a build and you're happy with it, but it gets walled by certain bosses or modifiers, that's fine, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a build that uses the Twisted Arbalest as its primary damage source for every boss, no matter how bad the matchup is, without changing anything about it. It's not going to be an overpowered build, but it will be something that you can take to any boss in the game and do very well with. If you want to take aspects of this and tweak them to have better matchups against certain bosses, feel free to do so. You can just consider this the solid foundation that you can then deviate from to suit your playstyle. With that out of the way, allow me to present to you the final version of the green Crosshair build that I used to complete 2 solo campaigns on Apocalypse, as well as many other APOC adventures. I tested out a lot of variations before finally landing on this, and I'll talk about all of those different options, but for now let me just explain what's changed from my last video, and give a brief synopsis of what the build entails for anybody new here. For starters, the biggest change is we swapped Tranquil Heart for a reprocessed heart for reasons that I hope should be obvious. This is a huge amount of mod regen. The Reed of the Vaunt I swapped for Detonation Trigger, Spirit Stone I swapped for Cataloger's Jewel, Ring of Diversion for White Pawn Stamp. For traits, I swapped Untouchable for Siphoner to help with the reprocessed heart drain. The melee weapon isn't important. You can still use Misfortune Cracks. I just like the Assassin Dagger for style points. The Harmonizer on Nebula I swapped for Spirit Healer, and this is because we activate it enough that it actually gives us some pretty consistent healing, and it's extra nice because it helps offset the drain from the reprocessed heart, and it's even more extra nice because it passes on 50% of its strength to our summon, which you will notice has changed from the Reaver to the Flyers. I did not give these guys enough credit in my last video. They still have the issue where they will back away from whatever you're fighting, but this downside is easily played around, and in return, you get so many advantages over the Reaver. 2 separate points to overlap from, the option to use them one at a time so you're never without one, the ability to deal with matchups that the Reaver and the Hollow just can't reach. I truly believe that they're the best all-rounders. For you Reaver enjoyers, don't worry, the bosses that the Reaver can reach, he's still the best option for. But for the purposes of presenting a build to you guys that doesn't need to change anything up depending on the boss you fight, I will stick with the Flyers. You can think of the Reavers as being very good for some bosses and useless against others, whereas the Flyers are just good for everything. They are a little fragile, but between rugged and the fact that we'll be healing them with both our Nebula and our Relic, they actually have a lot more staying power than you'd think. For those of you new to this gimmick, the reason our summon is important to our build, despite the fact we have absolutely nothing in our build that boosts their damage, is because it enables you to be able to use the Twisted Arbalest to fight bosses that have infrequent or straight-up absent adds during their fight that you would otherwise use to bounce the discs off of and overlap your Guardian's Call explosions. And we do this by shooting our minion and triggering explosions off of them in addition to the boss itself, resulting in very respectable damage. It is my belief that the build I currently have is the strongest way to use the Twisted Arbalest as a primary damage source throughout the game and against all bosses. It's not shut down by empathy, it's not shut down by inaccessible weak spots, it's not reliant on rolling good affixes, and most importantly, thanks to this setup, it is not shut down by bosses that have no adds. If any of you have ever looked up OP Remnant 2 build and tried it out, only to bump into a boss or two that completely ignores your build, you know what I'm talking about. What's that newest one I've seen around, spamming the Bloodless Heart for infinite invincibility? Yeah, just pray you don't roll empathy, right? Maybe I just have an aversion to chopping block builds, but for those of you out there who chase the flavor of the month builds and then just move on to the next one when it inevitably gets nerfed, and you're not actually trying to experiment or go digging around in the off-meta toy box for some hidden gems, if you're listening, I know you just want to have some goofy fun, but give creativity a try. And Gunfire Games, you guys need to do a better job of encouraging people to do this by buffing the many, many terrible weapons and jewelry in this game. Who the hell is ever going to use Drazir Sniper Sigil or Phelan's Sigil? Alright, with that rant out of the way, I want to talk about some of the stuff I tried and why I landed on this specific setup. I received a lot of good suggestions from you guys, particularly about the Mutator we use on the Arbalest. Failsafe, as a pairing with Reed of the Vaunt, makes the free mod usage much more consistent, and I think that variation of this build has some merit, if only because it has higher highs in exchange for lower lows. If you've ever tried Bandit Spore Bloom and gotten 4 or 5 shots in a row, you can find that same hit of dopamine with this setup. Personally, I don't think any mod that only has one charge is a good candidate for failsafe. Someone suggested Prophecy. But the numbers on this thing, even at level 10, are just not good enough. I don't know if there's any gun in the game that wants to use this thing. The most interesting alternative that I saw was Pressure Point, and there's a lot of good reasons to give it a try. That extra damage is nice, especially because it synergizes with all of the explosion scaling that we're already getting, but that level 10 ability is huge, and because we're spamming this mod, it's actually quite a big increase to our DPS. I spent a lot of time trying to calculate whether the increase in damage made up for how much uptime we lose by not running feedback, and it's actually very close. It requires a lot more patience and a lot of careful positioning, but this Mutator will put in work for you. The thing that kills it for me, and the reason I'm running feedback, is that range. 7 meters is a lot smaller than you think it is. For reference, that's almost the exact distance between this dummy and that dummy. You need to be this close to the boss in order to hit it, and you really need to see it in practice. It's not that much. You will miss this a lot of the time. And while you'll have the extra time to position yourself because the mod takes a little longer to recharge, that's assuming you even have physical access to the boss, which you don't always have. Mothermind, for example, you'll never get close enough for Pressure Point to be any contributing factor in the fight. So if you activate Guardian's Call from more than like a spitting distance away, this Mutator does nothing for you, whereas feedback consistently offers you value every time you press the button. Now for jewelry, this setup is what I believe to be the happy medium between damage scaling and mod generation. Amulets like Reed of the Vaunt and the One True King sigil do offer some more mod generation, but as it is now, we already have nearly true 100% uptime for the mod against a single enemy while under the effects of both Reprocessed Heart and the Reality Rune. Any further mod generation, and it gets into overkill territory, so I opted for something to boost the damage instead. I'm using Detonation Trigger, but you could use the Golden Ribbon if you prefer the haste that it gives you. Or even Soul Anchor, which will improve the damage of your Nebula and your summon damage as well. For rings, Spirit Stone's 10% increased generation was inferior to the flat 10 per second that we're getting from Cataloger's Jewel, so that was just making an upgrade. We're keeping Follower because it's good numbers for no downside. Encrypted Ring helps keep us healthy through the Reprocessed Heart, and the White Pawn Stamp is another way to close the gap between our mod generation and the cost. Other rings I tried. The Blasting Cap is a very good way to scale our damage. It's better than the Shard Banded Ring if you're focusing on your Arbalest, but the Shard Banded Ring will also boost the damage of your Nebula, which is nothing to scoff at. I saw some people recommending crits through the Gambler and the Braided Thorn alongside something like the Tightly Wounded Coil and the Amulet Energy Diverter. So, a couple of things. Number one, critical hits are complete overkill for anything you'll find while mapping. We already have enough damage on this setup to one-shot everything with the Guardian's Call, even without any overlapping explosions, except for elites. But if elites are giving you trouble for some reason, just use them as fortune cracks, it trivializes them. Number two, for bosses, the boost to our sustained DPS that we get from having crits in our build does not make up for the opportunity cost of not having more mod generation in our build. I must stress this. The reason we want this much mod generation is because when we're fighting solo bosses, we're not getting nearly as much mod generation as we would otherwise because our disc is not bouncing around and overlapping 5 explosions. If you're fighting someone like the hatchery boss, sure, go nuts. Fill the screen with as many yellow numbers as you want. But take that build to Bruin, or Stone Warden, or Venom, or Sunken Witch, and you'll quickly see why crits are the inferior way to build this. Warlock. Warlock I would consider a side grade to the reprocessed heart. And you can have some, because I would consider this a side grade to the reprocessed heart because it allows you to run something like Tranquil Heart alongside it instead if you want to have that extra regeneration over time. But I would never recommend using them together. It's way too much drain. The hog lures. If you want to use the digested hog lure, for example, you have to... It's just bad. So when you activate Guardian's Call, it automatically reloads your gun. But sadly, this does not proc on reload effects like the hog lures. If you want to use the digested hog lure, you have to manually reload for long enough to see that buff pop up beneath your health bar and then activate the mod. And without any reload speed scaling, it basically cancels out the benefits it gives us in a sustained DPS calculation. The shiny hog lure is even worse. Phelan's Sigil. So I actually tested out a variation of this build that uses Arcane Strike alongside the One True King Sigil and Phelan's Sigil together to try and see if there was a way to create a rotation where you shoot a disc, use Guardian's Call, throw a spear, and then have that spear refill the mod so that we can do it all over again. Not only is this very clunky in practice, it doesn't give us very much mod power at all. Definitely not enough to sustain the rotation. Arcane Strike sucks so bad, not even those 2 jewelry pieces can save it. I think Gunfire mistakenly balanced this around the idea that of a melee-focused build that swings a lot being able to benefit a little from it, but that means that any other builds that just use their melee as a support slot can basically pretend that melee mod generation doesn't exist. And hey, with melee being completely gutted in the most recent DLC patch except for brain-dead steadfast and shield builds, there's even less of a reason to use these. Okay, moving on to archetypes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. Summoner is the clear winner, but I just want to answer some questions people had about other ways to trigger Guardian's Call explosions. I already mentioned Root Lash mod in the last video, but it also works with Very Good Boy and also the Engineer turrets. Again, neither of these archetypes give us nearly as much damage as Summoner does with its damage perk, so I wouldn't recommend using them on your build. However, if you do any co-op, this is worth keeping in mind in case your teammates have any turrets or dogs to shoot. Remember, your disc prioritizes bouncing to enemies over friendly NPCs whenever possible, so if you want the extra explosion, make sure to shoot the friendlies rather than the enemies. Speaking of shooting friendlies, you can't get Guardian's Call off of other players, so please stop staggering them with your frisbee, thank you. As long as we're still talking about archetypes, I want to discuss why we use Archon over Summoner for our Prime perk. On paper, it makes a lot of sense for Summoner to be the Prime archetype because Ruthless will be active 100% of the time, giving our minions a huge boost. In practice, though, without anything else scaling our summons damage, Ruthless does not give that big of a boost to our summons, and summons are generally bad at being a damage source anyway. It's important to stress that even in the fantasy world that summons do significant enough damage to be worth considering, it's not worth the opportunity cost of losing the mod generation from Tempest that we rely on to keep our mod as active as possible. Basically, you're shifting your damage source away from Guardian's Call and more towards your minions, which you can do if you want, but I think you'll find it quite underwhelming. Okay, something to keep in mind when you're actually playing this build. If you spam the mod button out of a dodge, sometimes it will play the activation animation, but you will not actually use the mod, requiring you to press it again. This is a glitch that can cut into your DPS, and until they fix it, which they may never given how nobody cares about this gun, I can only recommend that you exercise trigger discipline and wait until you're finally out of your role before pulling the trigger. There are many things about this gun that make it a lot of effort for not a lot of reward. With almost no defensive mechanics besides having a serviceable DR, this build demands a lot of skill from you in order to do well. You need to be familiar not just with how every attack is telegraphed, but with what noise they make so you can still dodge them even when you're turned away to shoot your minion. You need to have patience so that you don't accidentally shoot too soon and fail to mark your minion before activating. You need to have situational awareness to take advantage of poor positioning from the enemy being near any adds. You need to be constantly juggling your Relic, Reality Rune, and Nebula mod to ensure that your minions stay alive. But man, if you can handle all that, I promise you that this build enables some of the highest skill expression of any build in the game, while still being capable of clearing everything that the game can throw at you. After having beat the campaign on Apocalypse twice and going through a lot of adventures to kill the other bosses, and there may be a couple that I've missed, I can confidently say that the only truly bad matchups for this build are Shahala and Annihilation. Everybody else is well within this gun's comfort zone, and the ones that have ever-present bounce targets, like Primogenitor and the One True King, are complete pushovers. I recorded a lot of boss fights, and I'll showcase a few of the highlights here, but I'm also going to upload a separate video that contains all of the footage I recorded for this, including all of the bad matchups that other build guides would shy away from, just so that you can see not just how this build performs at its best, but also what you can expect from it at its worst. I'll also include a bonus clip of me going through the Corrupted Harbor so you can see one of the more difficult non-boss encounters, but as you probably already knew before you even fell down this rabbit hole with me, the Twisted Arbalest has never had any issues with mapping. Something I should also mention, I am recording this on the 9th of May, just after a small balance patch was released that included, among other things, a small buff to power creep, and a small buff to Burden of the Follower. All of the boss fights that I recorded were before any of these changes, so you can expect this build to perform slightly better than it already is in those recordings. And that's before you take into account that I was playing very, very sloppily. Alright, on to the showcase. Do not subscribe to me, I am not a content creator.
Certainly commendable.